Hello and welcome to Woman Up, the Desperate Artwives podcast series. I'm Susan Merrick, and today I'm speaking with Althea Greenan from the Women's Art Library at Goldsmiths University.
Hello, Althea. Althea, please could you tell me a little bit about your background and what brought you to the Women's Arts Library to start with?
I trained as an artist. I did an undergraduate degree at Bournemouth and Poole College of Art, and it was a degree called Environmental Design, and which really was mostly about democratizing art and thinking in terms of art being something in public spaces. So it had this, it was run by people who had actually been to Goldsmiths, trained up at Goldsmiths, but it had a kind of Marxist kind of ideology behind it. It was a little bit maverick. And then I went back to the States and did a master's in fine art and painting. How I ended up with the Women's Art Library is really through connecting with somebody who was at Bournemouth and Poole College of Art as part of a women's art group, and without the word feminism really being part of the discourse, it was just women getting together to think in terms of how to get exhibited. It was pretty straightforward. But this woman who was a student with me, well, she was the year ahead. Her name is Diane Roberts. Had done some projects, very ambitious curatorial projects. One was called Surveying the Scene, and through that, these initiatives that she started up through Artist Newsletter, was aware of the Women Artists Slide Library, which is what the arts organization was in London at that time. So we're talking about the mid-'80s here, 1980s. So when I went away to the States and came back, and moved to London, I just made a beeline to the Women Artists Slide Library, as it was then, to become a volunteer. And that was 1989. The library was based in Fulham Palace at that time. It was quite established. It had Arts Council funding. It had this flourishing magazine that it was part of a publishing program. They were also producing a women's art diary along with the Women's Press. So it was quite an amazing kind of organization to exist, let alone for me to be able to sort of join as a volunteer. My volunteer status didn't last very long. I was hired to become a personal assistant sort of role to the coordinator, Pauline Barry, sort of within a few months. So from 1990, actually, I've been working with the what's now the Women's Art Library. And probably performed just about every role that the organization had created in order for it to sort of function.
So where was it based originally, kind of as was the Women's Art Slide Library? Did it have a building? Did it function in that way?
This was an artist initiative. So the first place I think it existed was probably the proverbial shoebox under a bed. So, and I have spoken to people who were in the original collective that called itself the Women Artists Slide Collective, I think, who were writing letters to seeking funding from their personal addresses, but. What happened, I think it was in 1982, the organization found a home in Battersea Art Centre, and this was absolutely critical for this organization to kind of gain traction. And after that, secured funding, became... was constituted as an educational charity, all these steps that enabled it to kind of cohere and keep going. So, and of course, because it started as a slide registry, in other words, you're collecting material, you have to have a stable space for it, and you also have to start thinking in terms of preservation and how you take care of this material that you're collecting. All of that was sort of critical and started really in Battersea Art Centre. From Battersea, which at that point was actually hosting, I think, different community arts organizations. So this was all enabled by what was happening, the GLC, the politics of London at the time. And from Battersea Art Centre, the collection moved to Fulham Palace, thanks to Hammersmith and Fulham Council. Again, I believe it was tied in with a kind of programming that was supporting initiatives around women's everything, culture, sort of well-being. It was. I think there was a sort of women's committee that was working at the time. I believe this was 1985-86. And it stayed in Fulham Palace until 2001. So, and then went over to Central St. Martin's. So, and the collection kept growing throughout these different sort of phases.
Okay. So I'm really interested in how I've heard Katie Deepwell speak before about the move from the Women's Arts Slide Library to the Women's Arts Library. But my memory's foggy, and it would be really great to hear from you how the library ended up at Goldsmiths Uni as part of their archives.
At Central St. Martin's, there were shifts happening within the Arts Council funding programs, and the funding was coming to an end for the Women's Art Library. There were two funding streams, one from Arts Council that supported the magazine publication, and the second from London Arts Board, which is basically the Arts Council still, for the organization. And despite the best efforts of the people who were directing the Women's Art Library at the time, which was then called MAKE, the Organization of Women's Art, there was no way we could sustain the activities and also stay at Central St. Martin's. We were there, we were hosted by Central St. Martin's in their Charing Cross Road site, as long as we had our own funding, but we weren't supported by them. And so when we saw this shift, this change coming, the priority of the volunteer sort of so-called executive committee, i.e. sort of trustees, was to keep the collection together and to find a secure home for it, and to not have anybody come and cherry pick bits out of it, to actually keep the whole thing together. And by this time we're talking about books, catalogs, as well as these artist slide files, a massive collection of press-cutting artist files as well, photographs, posters. It's a wonderful and very rich and never comprehensive, but certainly it's the biggest English language collection on women's art, documentation of women's art in Europe, for sure. So, the priority was to keep this stuff together. And so we had wonderful kind of support from various feminist art historians who were based in different institutions. This was obviously going to be the way we were going to keep the collection together, was to find a host institution. So we had 3 bids in the end that were kind of solid. One was from Marcia Meskimen in Loughborough. Marcia really spearheaded this solution to keeping the collection together by producing this wonderful document as a bid from her based at Loughborough to bring the collection up there. The other was from Hilary Robinson, who was then based at the University of Ulster. And the third was from Goldsmiths, and instigated by Professor Janice Jeffries, who was then overseeing the development of the Constance Howard Research Resource, which is now the Goldsmiths Textiles Collection.
Yeah.
So there was a precedent here at Goldsmiths for a research center that is based on a collection. But Janice didn't make it all about her. She was working very closely with the then librarian, Sasha Shaw, and the subject librarian for art and design, Jacqueline Cook. And these 3 wonderful feminists made it possible for the Women's Art Library collection to become part of the special collections here at Goldsmiths. And this move meant the collection was never really went dark. I mean, there were a few months where it wasn't particularly accessible, but it almost immediately remained accessible to members or, of the public. Because really the other priority about looking after a collection like this, and it's very, very tricky to maintain access, but it's absolutely critical that it does remain, it never goes into a kind of storage sort of situation or depend on some kind of funding that people are hoping will come through, or there might be some understanding, but it's not actually in place. For this collection to not be dependent on a particular academic or an academic department, I think in the end was absolutely critical to its surviving and thriving in the way that it has ever since.
Well, I'm really excited by what you are doing with the library kind of now and going forward as well, so I'll come back to that. But before I do, you mentioned about the Make magazine as well that was published. I was wondering what decisions were in place when that kind of stopped being published. I suppose it was a fantastic resource, and is a fantastic resource for us now in the archive. But what decisions were made for that to stop?
When all this was happening, I was the so-called research and resource education manager. I wasn't directly involved with how the Arts Council was reviewing the magazine, but it really was a straightforward, the magazine, the future is digital. We're talking the very late 90s, early 2000s. Is there an argument for producing a magazine that focuses just on women's art? It seems like a silly argument now, but really throughout the 90s, this is a bit of a cliche, I say it all the time, but the feminism was the F word. Nobody actually mentions it. Yeah. And it's one of the kind of vox pop questions of some of the issues in the magazine as well. And we were very aware how important but how tenuous our raison d'etre, for how to maintain the relevance and the liveliness of the debate, which we knew was very important, but it's a different matter, sort of maintaining a readership or renewing your readership. Yeah. And the Arts Council are always maybe a few steps behind what the rest of the world is there. Who knows? I mean, but in any case, it was really a straightforward, no more funding rather than no more relevance. Yeah. And a lot of people did miss it. But but interestingly, totally in a way unforeseen, but it makes a lot of sense now looking back, there has been an incredible legacy from this publication that continues because of its becoming an electronic journal. And it is a surge of sort of scholarship and interest in this early, early-ish feminist art histories, debate. I mean, it was never meant to be a kind of academic journal sort of format in the same way that Katie Deepwell's amazing En Paradoxa publication is. It was always meant to be a little more sassy. It depended on the editors, of course, but really more led by practice and academics, giving a space for academics to be a bit more experimental as well with their writing, too. So it was a looser space, the Women's Art magazine Make. And, I think it was different, and I think that's maybe what made the Arts Council nervous. I don't know. Yeah. But it's got this afterlife with the royalties, which now support bursaries and artists coming in and carrying on a kind of dialogue with all the artists that are sort of represented in the Women's Art Library.
Yeah, so please, can you tell us a bit more about what's happening with the Women's Arts Library now and what your aims are for it?
Well, my particular aims are to keep this connection with contemporary practice very much alive through inviting artists and collaborations like Women Now into so that this collection of stuff, which looks like other collections, other archives, is also a kind of thinking space, what I call a rhetorical space, quoting the theorist Lorraine Code. In other words, that because this material gives a sort of a very rich context for new practice, for new women's art practice, to sort of to cite, to see themselves in, to come and play with, respond to, and I think to be recorded, to be sort of taken into account. What I'm always going back to is the early mission and the early vision for the slide registry, which was really artists joining this registry, generating their own documentation and sending it into this slide library for others to use, for others to introduce into their teaching as well. Everybody was teaching. Everybody had that kind of day job. And so it was about women self-identifying as artists. And I think that's also a very critical thing, especially important now, I think, where there's so many other restrictions or commercializing. There's so many different ways that art is being taught and kind of distorted, I think, in terms of how it relates to our personal lives. So I think this record that the Women's Art Library has made of those decades, and I'm still adding to this collection, by the way, as well. I think there's a different kind of continuity, a different story, and a different way of experiencing, the visual arts in this collection. That's a little bit more critical than just doing a very good job at maintaining a load of papers and making sure the photographs don't get moldy. It's not just about the stuff.
Well, I was aware that you were continuing the collection, and that makes me really excited, because I think it could be, as you said earlier, it would be really sad to see such an amazing collection be simply a collection that was put to one side, and it's something to look at and see as when there's so much work to do as women artists, as feminists, as women in the world. So it's really important that the work that you're doing, that it is still growing, that it is a collection that continues, because we need this place where student artists, where women artists can come and see the work that is happening, that has happened, not only to see what's happening now and record that, but to reflect on what's happened, in the last few decades, see what's changed, what hasn't changed. I was at university recently doing an MA, and I had people asking me why I was interested in feminist work, why I was so bothered about concentrating on it. when stuff's been done, it's been done. Why are you bothering with that? but we're bothered with it because it's still relevant. It's still current. If it wasn't, it would go away. But we are still doing it. But also the other point of women perhaps potentially replicating work in some cases. Is because women's art still isn't seen as much as it should be. It's still underrepresented, not only in museums and galleries, but in libraries, in university courses. There is still very little feminist art taught in art school curriculums. It's still a bit of a hush-hush word. We can talk about feminism, but it's not a real thing that we put seriously with art. So it's so important to have this collection available, so that other artists can come, they can research, can find this work, and hopefully more so, with everything becoming more digital.
It's interesting because the artists, we've been running projects for quite a while now. We came to Goldsmiths in 2002, 2003. I think the first bursary was realized in 2009. So, from 2009 to the present, we've had supported a lot of sort of new work created by artists and projects. A lot of them are performative, and this is very kind of interesting. It's a lot about reenactment. So it's not even just that, I didn't know about these artists, and it's really interesting to know about somebody like Artemisia Gentileschi, who, we're suddenly discovering now. It's really about artists finding themselves in this discourse too. So, and what you said earlier about the issues haven't gone away is incredibly important. And is played out in different ways in this collection. And one of the most sort of interesting projects that has one of the sub-collections that has kind of exploded in a lot of ways in the last few years in the Women's Art Library is the Women of Color Index, which is just a smallish group of files on black women artists who were coming through in the sort of mid-'80s. And this collection was put together by the Black American artist Rita Keegan. And she was working with Eddie Chambers, who was a curator running a project out in Bristol, when we're talking the 80s again, called the African Asian Visual Artists Archive. He was actively documenting exhibitions. And between him and Rita, they built up this sort of mirror collection of photocopies on the women who were sort of coming through as artists in the UK, black women artists. Now, when more recently we had a wonderful group called X Marks the Spot, who I was able to commission to work with what we call the Wokey, with a grant from the estate of Gillian Eleanor. Now, Gillian Eleanor was a feminist art historian who was who was part of the early collective of the Women Artists Library, actually. And this is wonderful thing that happens when you're involved with a collection or an organization that actually kind of lasts longer than maybe 10 years. We're getting into the third decade, and this is wonderful kind of circular kind of support. We're able to kind of revisit and acknowledge earlier contributions and figures like Gillian Eleanor. So with this funding, X Marks the Spot who had worked with the Joe Spence archives, was able to work with the Women of Color Index, and they created a small publication called a Creative Finding Aid, and this it was led by Ego Ahiwe-Sawinski, who had just qualified as an archivist at this point, and she was working with Gina Nembard, Lauren Craig, Jai Holloway, and Mystique Holloway. It was a lovely sort of collective of women, intergenerational actually, and this Creative Finding Aid was not so much about looking at the material and just indexing it. It was really about contacting Rita again and interviewing. It was sort of like an updating, and it was really rediscovering this material, rediscovering these artists, and what this booklet has enabled subsequent people like Samia Malik, Rehana Zaman, and Michelle Williams-Gamaker do, is to create a kind of reading group for students who are everybody asking, why didn't I know about these women artists from my curriculum?
Yeah,
we've all been through art college. Why didn't I know who Brenda Agard was? People might know about Sonia Boyce, but there were all these women who were coming through at that point, all with very distinctive practices, in whose files we're still finding the same questions about the position of black women in culture in general, or racism in art schools. All these different sort of questions are being raised, and so there is this sort of reading group that has also come out of this collection, which has gone on to sort of do projects at the Tate and Nottingham, and they have a WordPress site. So that's an example of it starting with this material collection, but it has its own life now, and it's kind of out there in a different form. But yeah, it's something that is very exciting, actually.
That's really exciting, and I think that's what I'm going to take away from this chat, and what I hope any listeners would take away from the chat, that you have this amazing collection here with so many amazing resources and names of people and actually let's invite artists to come and discover the Women's Art Library themselves, and look at what opportunities there are, not only in terms of bursaries, but in terms of the amazing resources that they could come and use as part of their practice or to instigate practice. So thank you very much, Althea.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This was Woman Up, a podcast series by Desperate Artwives.